Harish also defeated IBM's project debater in the first public debate between AI and a human.
Shine bright like a diamond. Shine bright like a diamond.
Hey everyone, my name is Marian Santo and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're met with special guest Harish Natarajan. Harish Natarajan is the head of economic risk at AKE International and a board member of Pulmix, which is a social media startup backed by the international president of the New York Times and President Macron's former chief advisor. A graduate of both Oxford and Cambridge, he has debated for over a decade and was the European debating champion in 2012 and the winner of over 30 other major debate competitions. Harish also defeated IBM's project debater in the first public debate between AI and a human. Harish's achievements have been covered in the global press and in Adam Grant's Think Again. Harish, it's such a pleasure to be doing this interview with you today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So let's just jump right into it. Given all this, massive accomplishments you've had with debate, it's fair that we step back in time a bit. Can you please tell us how and why you even began competitive debate?
Yeah, so I think like many things, and we're going back 15 years, the reason I started is my parents made me, which is my parents really wanted me to do an extracurricular activity. Before I was applying to university, they were like, you must do something. And like many kids, I just couldn't be bothered to do anything. I would do my work and I just wanted to come home or go out with friends. But the debating society started, I think, on Thursdays right after school. It was really convenient. It would last 1 hour. So I was like, fine, I'll do that. But the first time I walked in, and the first time I gave a speech, which would be in front of maybe 20 people at most in my school, I just loved the activity. And it was partly that it was intellectual, that you were sharing your own ideas, thinking critically, responding to others. And part of it was theatrics. And that was a combination, at least to begin with, which I absolutely loved. And that started in my school, but then after you do a bit of it, you're like, what else is there? Well, you find some inter-school competitions. You go to university and participate more at university. And what I found with debating is, while I was okay to start with, it took me quite a while before I understood the key skills and how to actually convince an audience. But once you start getting there and you see yourself improving, it becomes really addictive to stay involved because you can see marked improvements yourself. Debating had metrics of success, which is you have speaker tabs, which is the list of speakers at the tournament. You would have a tournament once every week, and it'd be like, can you win one of these? Or can you be the top team before the final in these? And that kept me involved for years and kept me involved in competitive debating for years.
So you begin debate and you go to debate at the university levels, both at Oxford and at Cambridge. Can you walk us through this journey, and did debate ultimately influence what you ended up studying at both universities?
Well, so at the University of Oxford, I studied politics, philosophy, and economics. I don't think debating influenced me to do that per se, but it is a very popular subject amongst debaters. And part of the reason for that is it's incredibly broad. And one of the things about debating is you're not really expected to be a specialist on anything. In the formats I'm most used to, you get a topic, you get 15 minutes, you're assigned to side. And in some ways, that rewards having broad knowledge rather than deep knowledge. And I actually think that's what attracts lots of debaters, kinds of subjects I was doing, which is you're doing 3 different subjects, all of which are related to social science and to the kinds of topics you see in debating. So I wouldn't say I did the topics I did because of debating, but certainly I think there is some kind of conditional aspect of it, which is it's what debaters often find to be very interesting. But in terms of what happened for my own debating journey at Oxford, I think when I started at Oxford, I wasn't particularly good at debating at all. I had done some schools debating, but it never really made a huge amount of sense to me. How do you persuade someone? What is a good argument? How do you structure a speech? I think for me, I would incrementally improve over the years, but I never did a huge amount of it at Oxford. What changed though is once I finished at Oxford, one of my very good friends from back at school participated in the World Universities Debating Championships, and he got to the grand final. And we had a conversation afterwards. And one thing which went through my mind was, well, if he can do it, why can't I? And then when I started my postgraduate degree, paradoxically, I had an awful lot more time. My postgraduate degree was less structured than my undergraduate degree. I had a lot of work, but I didn't have to work every single weekday or most weekends. It was something which I was happy to throw myself back into. And again, I think my journey was not typical of most people's, that in the first few months when I was at Cambridge, I would have been 22 at the time. I wasn't doing particularly well at debating tournaments, but there's the tournament right before the World Championships. And my partner and I at that tournament finished about midway down. We were probably about the 50th and 51st best speaker at the tournament. And that wasn't a great result. This was a mid-sized British tournament. But I think after that tournament, things clicked a little bit for me. And 2 weeks later, we were at the World Championships, and with the third best team, the 10th best speaker. And it was always difficult for me to explain what really happened in those couple of weeks, which really affected the way I think about debating. But the greater lesson for me from that, and what I always tell everyone, is your improvements aren't linear. There can be a moment where something just makes sense and you can improve really rapidly. And it can be really frustrating right up until that point, and then really invigorating after that point. But once I had reached the point where things started making more sense, I just kept doing more debating, particularly at the University of Cambridge, and in part because I actually had the time to.
Interesting story. So please tell us, once things clicked for you and you figured out a system that worked, that led you to become so successful at debate, what's that strategy? So what is your strategy for debate prep?
Well, I'll step back one moment and just explain what actually clicked for me.
Okay.
Because that's a lot over the years. And what clicked for me, and I think in those 2 weeks, is you don't need in every single debate speech to try and prove you're the smartest person in the room. You don't need to try and come up with the most innovative and interesting ideas, because that's not really the most persuasive ideas. Often the things which are most powerful are simple ideas explained well. And once I made that breakthrough, I went from thinking, what would Foucault say about this topic, to what's the actual argument? What does this really mean on the ground? And that, I think, was the first part of the way I started thinking about debating. And that, I think, made a huge difference. And there's been lots of other improvements or ways I thought about debating since. And while I haven't done serious speaking now, competitively myself in about 2 years, I think the way I look at debates as a process is relatively straightforward now. It's that you have a topic, and the first question you should ask yourself isn't what arguments do I have for this, but it's what do I need to do to prove to an audience or a judge that on balance, this idea is good or this idea is bad. And one of the implications of thinking about debating that way is you realize you concede a lot of ground. The real world is complicated enough that there are very few things which are just clearly good or clearly bad ideas. In reality, there are always shades of gray. The other side, the person who disagrees with you, probably has a point in some places. And it's about just trying to move slightly towards the middle ground. You don't need to prove something is a terrible idea or the best idea in the world. You just need to prove on balance it's a better idea than it is a bad idea. I think for me, it is partially being willing to cede ground and try to sound as reasonable as you could be and picking the most reasonable approach. And then I think when I look at the idea of being on balance correct, what you have to realize is you can win arguments, you can lose arguments, you'll be right in some areas and wrong in some areas. The question is, why are the arguments you're winning more important than the arguments you're losing? So my process when I'm in a debate, when I start prepping for a debate, is first, what do I need to prove? And here are my arguments, here are their arguments. I have a rough idea of what they're going to say. And while I don't need to win every single one, I don't need to say every single one of the other side's arguments are incorrect. I just need to prove that on balance, my arguments or my case is more powerful than yours. I think that's always the first part of my process of debating. And from that, you try and construct arguments. You try and explain at each point why this argument really matters in the context of the debate. You try and look for ways of explaining it in the most powerful and persuasive ways you can. But that I think is the more micro part of how I would then go into preparation. But the macro part is just asking yourself what you actually need to prove, what ground are you willing to cede?
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for walking us through that. So you then go on to win the European University National Debating Championship. Can you please tell us more about that moment and the culmination of getting there?
Yeah, so this would have been in 2012, but I had been in the final of European Championships in 2010 and 2011, and both of those were interesting experiences their own way. In 2010, I had been relatively successful at debating, but I had to be very successful and won a few tournaments and a couple of mid-sized, but not the biggest tournaments. And we reached the final, and in all fairness, and I say this now, we thought we won the final. The judging panel, however, split 5-4 against us. And this is one of those moments I think lots of debaters have when you're in finals, you think you got the wrong call, but it means something slightly different when it's the final of a major international tournament. And we decided, well, okay, we've done well at this one. We're going to go back the next year. And we were better the next year. We had had a year more preparation. I'd spoken with my partner then for another year. We were probably done well over 100 debates together at that stage. And then we got to the final again. This time we were almost certainly better. And again, we lost the final, this time probably fairly. But having got to 2 finals, feel that one has been stolen from you and that you're constantly getting better. The only thing to do is to continue and try and go for that 3rd final, which is what we did. So we probably did another 5 tournaments together. I think the interesting thing is having been to 2 finals, having had all that experience, having done all those tournaments, that year in the run-up to the tournament, we were winning many of the preparation tournaments, that we probably walked into the tournament as the favorite. Now, in some ways that may sound good, but actually when I look back at it, it was one of the most exhausting experiences I ever had. It had far more pressure than the previous years, that we knew if we didn't win it this year, we were probably never going to be able to win this tournament. And what we finally did, one of the questions I think we both verbalized later is we didn't know whether we would be happy about it or just be relief. It turned out it was happiness, that having spent all that time, that it was finally winning that tournament, which we had spent so much effort trying to win. But once that had happened, it was like, well, what's next? I think that's always one of the questions for debating. We've done all of this. Are we satisfied? Not entirely. There's probably more to be won.
Yes, for sure. And you have the amazing reputation of amassing over 30 major debate wins. So, what was this process of getting win after win after win after win?
Yeah, so it almost sounds more misleading than it is, which is they're all kind of a concentrated period. There's a few at the start, but really it's probably from about 2010 to about 2013, where we're just winning lots and lots of tournaments. And it's one of those weird experiences because at some point you go to the tournament and after the tournament's over, you're asking, well, why was I there? And part of the answer is there are friends which you want to spend time with. There are people who you want to speak with at debating, that it kind of interesting social events. But was the debating itself always going to be that interesting? And I think for me, sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes the answer was no. I took a break from actually speaking for a couple of years, returned after that to do more. And for a while again, it became really fascinating, particularly when I was going to the run up to the World Championships now back in 2015, so 5 and a bit years ago, as the last major debating tournament I would do. And what struck me was the debating itself and the argument itself had lost a little bit of the interest, but that competitive spirit, when that was back, then I really started caring about the tournament wins. Not so much just because they're a number, but because it was always, what do you need to do after this tournament to improve? And that to me wasn't always the way I thought about tournaments. When I do it for fun, I do it for friends, something to do. But when I was doing it competitively, then it was, what can you do to improve? How would you do it better? And that to me is actually one of the most fun parts of debating. Looking back at the time, obviously, that was quite stressful.
So do you want to drop any tips or any hints about how people who are currently doing debate or who may want to start debate, how they can go about, making sure that they're improving after every few tournaments or practices?
Yeah, to me, one of the core things is to be self-critical. And I say very carefully, because I think lots of us end up being overly self-critical at all points. That we go, no, that was never good enough, no matter what the judge says, what we call to be an imposter syndrome. But in some ways, and I wouldn't say this very carefully, there are times when it's useful to lean into that feeling that you could have done better, but how would you have done better? What would you do differently the next time? And I think it's in part because we're almost always going to be our best teachers, which is you can do a debate. You'll get 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes of feedback from a judge, maybe a bit more from a coach. But you have a lot more time thinking yourself, what would you have done differently? And to me, whether we won or whether we lost, it would be, what would I do if I got this topic the next time? And I think part of that is, how would I make the arguments better? What new examples would I use? What new responses would I use? And over time, that actually really has a huge impact on your own debating, because when you're not satisfied per se, it can allow you to improve what you are doing because you're pushing yourself and coming up with things all the time. And to me, the moment where I realized I probably don't need to do any more competitive debating is when I stopped being able to do that, because it just didn't matter that much to me as to whether I would be better the next time than I was before. Now, the big caveat here is you have to also believe that you can be better. And you realize that it's something which is very plausible. For almost everyone, it definitively is. But I think there's some belief that it's not just that you did things that you didn't do well and you can never do better, or there's some kind of block in the way. It's actually partially because of experience. And for me, there are moments when I think about when I was younger and watching top debaters debate and going, this is total magic. How can you do this in 15 minutes? How can you come up with these arguments? And then once you start doing it and start understanding it and realizing it's not that you're coming up with an entire set of arguments in that 15 minutes, it's that you're recalling arguments, then augmenting arguments. And when you hear something, it's almost subconscious, by which I mean, it's intuitive, which is there's this pattern recognition, which is going on in your head, which is, I've heard this argument slightly differently, but I know how to respond to a different version, how to respond to this version. And to me, that's all partially about experience. But it's not just going to tournament after tournament. It's asking yourself after every debate, what would I have done differently? And realize that you may not think of yourself as a great debater, you may not even think of yourself as a good debater. But whether or not that is true, over time, you will become very good if you keep asking yourself, what do I need to do to improve? And realize for most people, the difference between being an average debater, being a great debater, is just going to be experience. And even when you see someone you think, I could never do that, the reality is almost anyone who's been a successful debater at various points looked at other debaters and was like, how can they do that? How could I ever be this eloquent? How could I come up with all these arguments? And the reality is, after a while, it becomes fairly easy to do.
In 2019, you were part of a first public debate between AI and a human, defeating IBM's project debater. Please recount this experience for us. What strategy made you successful during this debate?
Well, I'll start with just a background of that experience, because this was in San Francisco, now 2.5 years ago. But what I vividly recall is I had never seen project debate before. I had seen images of it, but I didn't really know what it would be like. And the moment we walked into the auditorium, there was maybe 1,000 different computer screens around. There were people everywhere. There are cameras everywhere. And it was totally unlike any other experience, debating or not, I had ever been in. And you show up on stage and there is however many people in the audience, a couple thousand, and then being told at various points, 1 million people watching this live feed. And that all seems really alien. But the thing which struck me when I look back at it is it was all a really odd experience, right up until I was asked to start thinking about the topic, and right up until I'm on stage delivering my speech. And then my view was, it's not actually that different than debating against a human. You're going to be using some of the same skills you always would be using. You have a disadvantage against a machine. I had realized beforehand, definitely true, I would have nowhere near the empirical evidence that it would have. But that's something I'm quite used to, because you don't walk into a British parliamentary debate with 15 minutes preparation with a lot of information. It's what you can come up with and what you can recall. So to me, the experience itself wasn't entirely different. But when it comes to think about the strategy which I used, part of it's almost, people always ask for a strategy, but I never really think that's quite the way I thought about it. I just thought about it as another debate. How would I approach any single debate? And it was the same way, which is, there are arguments I am going to lose. The debate was, this house would subsidize preschool education. And being from Europe, I was like, why is this a debate? This seems like a trivially good idea. Okay, so let's step back and think through it. And I realized pretty quickly, I don't want to be contesting whether or not there should be state funding for preschool education. That doesn't seem to be a great thing. You don't want to run a purely libertarian line against any kind of state funding. So what is the approach then? Well, mine was concede a lot of ground. Yeah, preschool education probably is good. Equality is good. Sure, there is a role for the state in welfare services. Let's accept all of that. And let's still try and win the debate. And that is probably fairly similar to what I would have done against most humans who I'm debating against. And then the arguments become about the real opportunity costs, how this is probably going to play out politically, what this probably means as to which kinds of families gain and which don't. So I think for me, again, it was, what ground can I cede? And in this case, I probably need to cede more ground, because you can't contest the areas, particularly because I don't have the evidence to, but it isn't entirely dissimilar from how I would debate against a human.
So your impressive debate accomplishments have been recognized in the global press and in Adam Grant's Think Again. So tell us more about this.
I mean, it's always one of those weird things for me, in that IBM's Project Debater is incredibly technologically impressive. But on objective ground, it's by no means my greatest debating achievement. It wasn't the hardest debate I've done, even though but that isn't taking anything away from IBM and what they've done at a technological level. Debating, particularly for a machine, is extraordinarily difficult. And there's always that sense of almost embarrassment, which is, we're talking about debating, but we're talking about debating because of this debate. And the insights you're getting from how I debate is from this debate against a machine. And sure, there are bits of it which are generalizable, but to me, there's always that opening question, which is, of all the debates I've ever done, is this the one which is going to jump out? And I think the answer is probably yes. But after that, though, it was actually quite an interesting experience, because sure, lots of the people you talk to in the press just want to talk about IBM, but the ones who really wanted to talk about it beyond that, which is, what is the value of debating? What can a machine do and a human can't do? Is there anything essentially human about debating? And some of those conversations, which I've had with a range of different people, Adam Grant amongst them, as to what is effective communication and persuasion, have been really useful for me in two different ways. The first is, when you are debating, very few people think about it theoretically as to what exactly are you doing. It's instead, this works. And it makes a lot of sense. I'm going to continue doing it. But why do you do it? And I think part of these conversations helped me a great deal in that. The second thing is it's helped me a lot in what I do now, which is I do most of my debating is now involved in debating coaching. And one thing about coaching to me is you can watch someone debate and you go, that's not the way they should have done it, but why? And part of the answer is my intuition would not push me in that direction. Well, what does that mean? Um, it means subconsciously I'm recognizing patterns, and that tells me I should do this. But of course, when you're coaching, subconscious pattern recognition is of no value. You're starting to push the conscious pattern recognition. And in part is once you have more and more of these conversations, you think more about what theoretically am I doing? Why am I doing it? Why is it going to be effective? And those part of the conversations which you are having with some of the people who are experts in their field of communication, of persuasion, have actually been really enlightening, partially in telling me theoretically what persuasion is, but paradoxically, also helping me understand implicitly at times what I was doing, which I had never thought about.
What has debate's impact been on your life, both personally and professionally?
So I think it's had a huge impact on the way I do things, which is the way I speak in a debate isn't that distinct from how I would give a presentation for my clients at work. Obviously, the content is different, the amount of evidence you have is different, but the way I'm thinking about it, which is I'm trying to make this point, I'm trying to make this argument. How am I going to structure it? What are the various parts of the story which I'm telling? Because a presentation to me is a story, coming up with an outcome, explaining why you get to this conclusion. And in a sense, a debate speech is like that as well. It has more formal rules as to how exactly you're formulating the story. But it's the same idea, which is this is the context. This is what's important. Let's take you through the steps to get us there. And to that degree, it's had a huge impact on how I give presentations, how I write essays back at school, and everything else. How I write a client report now, it will all be similar enough to the way in which I think about debating, albeit just in different forms. And professionally, I think that's had a huge impact on what I do. But I think there's a couple of other things which is probably worth highlighting, which is I think I'm relatively introverted, and definitely as a child was relatively shy. But it was always when I was on that debate stage or in that debate room. None of that mattered so much because there was just a degree of confidence. And that built up more and more over the years. Because I mean, at the start, it was somewhat there, but it was also somewhat bravado. And then you would be debating against people much better than you, and that confidence would shatter very, very quickly. But to me, what definitely built up is as I did more and more of it. And partially as you become better at debating, you can build that confidence in almost any single setting as to, I can talk about this because what is the difference between being here and anywhere else? Now, does that always work on a personal or one-to-one level? Certainly not. But definitely on a presentational level, and when you're talking to crowds, that's had a huge impact on me. On a more grounded personal level, I think debating has made me much more open to new ideas. And there's two ways I think about this, which is when you're debating and doing lots of it, you realize a couple things, which is there are very few arguments which you will have where there aren't two sides of that argument. The real world is complicated enough that when you have to think about the best side, which you disagree with, you realize there's probably quite a lot of arguments there. And maybe your certainty, which you previously had, really wasn't warranted. The flip side of that is when I then strongly have a position, it ends up becoming pretty strong because I feel I thought through all the arguments. But there are very few areas where I would argue, where I would even say I have a strong position right now. And I don't know if this is a virtue or a problem, but I do think it is very useful that we get to a position where we can realize most disagreements we have are not about people who are fundamentally right and fundamentally wrong, or someone who is evil with just terrible values and someone who isn't. but people who can have reasonable views in many cases sometimes will disagree, and that disagreement could still be very respectful. I think to me, that's the real value of debating, which is once you find out more about the world, once you have to look at every single issue from every single side, that can be incredibly enlightening.
Powerful words, powerful words. So let's talk about Pulmix. You are a board member of Pulmix, which is a social media startup backed by the international president of the New York Times and President Macron's former chief advisor. Tell us more about this.
So I'll just start with a tiny bit of background as to the idea of the app. So Pulmix is now about 3 months old, to be launched about 3 months ago. And the idea from it is that there are two real problems if we look at discourse in the world right now. The first one is partially created, but not exclusively by social media, which is we have these curated news feeds that if you're on Twitter, you're reading the news, which you probably like. If you're on Facebook, it is what your friends are sharing or the groups which you pay attention to are sharing. And the truth is that whether you're liberal, whether you're conservative, we're all in a very curated echo chamber where we're hearing lots of people who we agree with. And indeed, if you actually look at the research behind this, particularly on Twitter, and look at the nodes of communication between Republican Twitter, Democratic Twitter, actually there are very few cases where there are actual interactions between them. And if you actually think about it, if you are a perfectly reasonable human being, you have reasonable opinions, but you're continuously being fed information from one side, what else are you going to believe? So I'm currently in Belgrade, and I think this is often brought home to me here, which is the people around the city are wonderful. 25 years ago, how many of them would have supported a tyrannical dictator involved in campaigns of ethnic cleansing? I think the reality, though, is if you were Serb in the 1990s, all the media you're being fed is telling you what is happening, who these people are, and they're your enemy, that this is an existential about self-defense. And that's an extreme version of it. But whoever you are, that's a very difficult position to ever extract yourself from. So these echo chambers end up being real problems for lots of us. The other one is, if you think about the nature of public debate and discourse now, often it occurs on social media, but not alone. And part of it is that it's almost never respectful discussion of two different ideas. So it doesn't have the best stuff I like about debating. And I think there's several reasons for that. I mean, some of it is some ideas probably shouldn't be respectfully discussed. But I think that's probably a subsection, a tiny subsection of all the ideas which we actually have. I think it's partially because the feedback mechanisms, which is a very long thought out comment on Facebook, is probably not going to get the same reactions that 2 sentences, which are going to be pithy and biting, have. That what is shared on my Facebook wall about people on the right is going to be the most extreme versions of that. So I think in many ways, what we end up with isn't just polarized discourse. It ends up being any representation of the other side is probably more extreme. And the kinds of ways we interact, just by the nature of social media, ends up being far too extreme and never really respectful of the views of other individuals. And I think when we have these two problems, one of the ideas of Pulmix is, can we partially deal with them? And our idea is that there will be a topic, multiple topics every single day, that someone will post videos supporting it, someone will post videos opposing it. But the first core bit is that's all on the same platform, with one video, then the next video, one video, then the next video. The second thing is, how exactly do you get people to interact respectfully? And part of it is that you're putting your actual name, your actual face, so credibility and sincerity to it. But the other part is, well, what's the feedback mechanism? And for us, one of the most powerful things is you can see a video, you can be convinced by the argument someone's making, or you could respectfully disagree. There is no negative response here. But one of our bets from that is, as we end up having more and more users, it's going to be videos which are moderate, which the other side could potentially like, are going to be the ones which are getting the most reactions, and the ones which are then going to be the ones prioritized. And our hope is that this will serve in a small way as something which can make a difference to public debate and public discourse.
This sounds amazing. And can people download the app through the Apple Store, iTunes, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so the app is available on the Google Play Store and on the App Store. Currently, though this should change very soon, in order to sign up, you need an invitation code. You are all free to use mine, which is HN007. And then feel free to browse it, send us any thoughts, share it with your friends. We're all hoping that people get something out of it.
That's amazing. Yes, I'll be sure to include that code in the description box. So please look out for that code in the description box. Okay, so I think you've touched on this with, is it am I saying the name right? Pulmix or Polymix?
Polemics is how we do it.
Polemics, thank you, polemics. You've touched on this, but I want you to talk more about it, which is how can debate be applicable to the real world? And how have you seen previous students or debaters implement it?
Oh, wow. There's two very different answers which push in entirely different directions here. I'll start with the negative version of what debating means for the real world. And it's this, which is, if you do competitive debating, in 15 minutes about a topic you have next to no information, you can come up with a compelling speech. Maybe in some ways that's good. In many circumstances, though, that can be very negative when you're not speaking about your own convictions, where you're almost acting as a devil's advocate, but not even quite doing that. It's what's advantageous for me to argue at this very point. Can I make a case for it? Can I convince people about it? And I think that's in some ways one of the, probably the inherent and continuous negative about our political system, but certainly something which debating feeds into, that give you a false sense of confidence and presenting a false sense of confidence that you know what you're talking about, when in reality, more often than not, you probably don't. That I think is at least, that's one of the negatives of debating. But I think it's almost counterbalanced, and probably more than counterbalanced, by the potential positives which you get from it. And these are going to be different for all kinds of different people. And just through my experiences, there are people who just start debating, where I think you actually get the biggest returns, which is, can I give a structured speech? And am I able to communicate to others about my opinions? Am I able to talk out loud? When you do a little bit more debating and it bleeds into how you give presentations, how you write essays, well, that's again the ability to make a structured argument very carefully. And all arguments are going to be roughly the same, at least in social sciences, if you exclude actual science, which is, as a result of whatever this is, something happens, that thing is good and that is important or unimportant. And that I think has just a huge impact on the way I write, but also when I see people, the way they write and the way they present arguments in general. But I think the final part of debating, which can be very useful, is what I mentioned before. It's that you start realizing that the world is complicated. And this might just sound so trivial, but I actually do think when we're young, when you don't have a lot of life experience, the default is to actually think of things as much simpler than they actually are. Things are black and white. They're morally good or morally bad. And in reality, that's almost certainly wrong. There is just so much more complexity to it. And I think debating allows you to start unlocking bits of that complexity. As long as you realize you're only unlocking bits of it, and there is PhD fields in some of the topics you're talking about. But I think even that first bit, which is nothing is quite as simple, very few things are quite as simple as we think they are. I actually think that's one of the best things about debating, which is you realize there is another side. You realize that you should be listening to people from all kinds of fields to try to listen to what they have to say. And don't form your mind, don't make up your mind too easily or too quickly.
Interesting, interesting. Well, Harish, it might be too early to start thinking about this one, but what do you hope your legacy would be?
Um, I think one of the realities is, like everything in life, things move really quickly. What I would like to have said is there are parts of debating where I think I have had a moderately large influence, which is, but it's always difficult to say, which is what I've been involved for 10 years as things have changed an awful lot to be part of those changes. I think lots of them have been very good, that debating has become more inclusive, that it has become more focused on arguments. And I've hopefully been at least part of that, a de-emphasis on occasion on style. But I don't think of any of that as really what I want my debating legacy to be, which is, I think part of it is, um, I've done a lot, I've been successful, but the things which I actually care the most about are often the people you meet. It's that, how have you helped people you met become better at debating? And that might just sound like it's about the small university activity, but often for many individuals, it's not. It's something which is opens their mind. That sounds cliche, but I guess to make it more accurate, often opens people to new opportunities that they never had before, opens them to confidence, which you never had before. One of my friends once told me that one of the biggest advantages for him for debating is he never thought he could compete with people from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Stanford. And then in debating, he did. Wasn't a native language speaker, and then realized, sure, I'm not from one of the most prestigious universities in the world, but actually in so many fields, I can do as well as they do. And that to me is actually one of the great things about debating. And that's parts of the inclusivity, which it aspires to have. And there's obviously a lot more which can be done, but that's the part of debating I care the most about, which is the people you meet and the people who, when you could talk to them, you actually do have a big impact on their lives.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, Harish, thank you so much for joining us for this interview today. Guys, thank you so much for watching this interview. Please be sure to like and subscribe to this video and see you next time.